Right, so my talk today, as Richard has pointed out, is entitled Beyond Safety Standards Designed for User Acceptance. I'm going to just mention our work, the URF's work, the Urban Robotics Foundation work, is about public area mobile robots. The definition of those are robots that are operating in public spaces, in footways, bikeways, places where the public uses, walks, bikes, congregates. These are non-work places that are among the non-involved and untrained bystanders. So this is the opposite of the factory and warehouse where there's a lot of these robots already. What we do fundamentally, we're a non-for-profit. We encourage proactive regulation. We lead the writing of the standards, which I'll mention very briefly in a slide or two. And we write guidebooks, which I will introduce you to at the end, and invite you to a free copy of one of them. And those guidebooks help municipalities and facilities to prepare for PMR development. The draft technical standard that Richard mentioned, called 4448, Public Area Mobile Robots. I've shown here that it has 16 parts. We're not going to go into this. I can later, but that's not what today's talk is about. But I just wanted to tell you that in this case, as part of our work in preparing cities for this particular technology, I've divided these 16 parts into 3 clusters. The first major cluster is the behavioral cluster. So these are how ought these machines to behave in these public spaces when they're deployed. The second cluster is their operational context. What does the city need to do to prepare for these devices and so forth. And the third is safety related, and especially personal assistant related, because there's robots that kind of work with people. They might work with a maintenance person. They might work with an older person helping them carry things, and they might work in hospitals and airports actually carrying passengers. These are autonomous, in this case, autonomous wheelchairs. All throughout all of this work and all of my talk, the universal accessibility is central. So that's why I wanted to make sure that that was what was understood. So let's jump right into a conversation about innovation in the mobility space. Physical mobility, I'm talking about physical mobility in the sense of goods and passenger movement. I'm not talking about cellular technologies. So throughout this talk, my examples will come from the area that I've just described to you. In other words, public area mobile robots. So you may need to replace my examples with the examples more appropriate to your work, to your innovation. So for your innovation, you will conceive an idea or a design or a plan, and you will build your solution. You will seek sales and permission, or a license to operate or a license to deploy in an effort to win acceptance and growth in your market. However, likely your original idea is somewhat idealized, of course, as you thought about your solution. And your ideal may become somewhat frayed as time goes on. So in order to get permission to install or deploy, you will find there's a lot of conditions that you may not have considered that need to be fulfilled. And during that process, you may find out that acceptance is partial or begrudging or sometimes worse. Consider the case here in Toronto. I think many of you will be aware of or will have heard of a couple of years ago, a company that was building these PMRs for delivery. Was quite popular amongst its users. They had a half a dozen of these small devices, which were made to deliver food in this case. Very popular amongst its users. It ran into concerns from the accessibility community. Again, I'm underscoring accessibility. And those concerns actually resulted in a temporary ban. And if you look through the whole history of that, it was appropriate that they be banned, but it was very unfortunate for the innovator in that case, of course. So any city that you introduce mobility technology into, there's always a numerous set of aspects that need to be addressed to ensure successful implementation or just acceptance. I mean, if your technology is deployed, licensed and appreciated, that whole body of things is acceptance. We're talking about here permission to operate for the most part. So I'm going to be touching on all of these. I have a kind of a slide for each of them. That's what my talk is about. What I want to do is I want to say, because our work is in public area mobile robots, which are robotic devices and vehicles that operate among pedestrians and cyclists and cars and other bystanders, my examples will all come from that domain. So you need to look for analogies appropriate to your domain. For example, if you were in other forms of micromobility and so forth. So you have to be compatible with the context you're deploying into. When you access the existing infrastructure of the city, it's things like its roads and its sidewalks, their conditions, their accessibility rules, the digital network, dozens of things really, probably more things than you would have thought about when you were first designing your solution. Your technology has to adapt to or to be adapted by the current infrastructure without causing significant disruptions. Such disruptions are friction to your sales or deployment process. In this example, if a city or community is unable to address the infrastructure problem, then this is not the place for you to deploy. And that's what happened in this case. This is from a study that had to turn away the technology because its infrastructure was not ready. Here's the same checklist, different city, different problem. In this case, the robot must have a walk signal before it can cross the intersection. This walk signal is only available by pushing a button, which this robot cannot do, and cannot wait for a pedestrian to do so. The solution was to connect the robot using the digital network, connect that robot to the traffic signal so the robot could request the walk signal. So there was a little bit of communication software written that tied into the SAE standard to do that, and it worked. So in this case, it was successful, and this particular application will be used in multiple cities, of course. So, again, this particular example might not apply for you, but I think this one will more so. You need to know the regulatory and legal framework that you're going to be deploying into. So in this case, the national traffic laws, this has only happened in a few countries. In this case, Estonia, Japan, South Korea, they were changed. The National Traffic Act or laws were changed in those to recognize delivery robots. It's also the case that in the U.S., similar laws were provided as House and Senate bills in some of the 20 states. Again, but it wasn't national. These laws are sort of high level only. There's no guidance that's provided for traffic behaviors that a municipality would need to manage. No consideration was given in these laws to mobile security robots that operate in exactly the same space as the delivery robots. And there's no consideration given to maintenance robots that might be applying salt or picking up litter or sweeping or washing. These are also mobile devices operating again in exactly the same space, but they're not seen as transportation devices. Well, because they're not transportation devices. And so they're not covered in the Transportation Acts as they're currently written, because they're for surveillance and maintenance. So how should a city treat those? Given this, a city doesn't really have enough to proceed. So you might be excited as an innovator that, hey, I have the green light to innovate and to deploy, but you don't really, because in the end, all we have is a recognition of a category of your technology, but we don't have really a way to deploy yet. So what safety measures should you be considering? So in the case of public area mobile robots, it's much, much more than just lights and brakes as were provided in those national guidelines I just mentioned. There's already in place, any city you go to is already in place a complex infrastructure with existing users with their rules. So in this example, a car making a right turn on red correctly entered the crosswalk, apparently didn't see the robot. We're not sure about that. When the robot was blocked, it went around into the parking lane or what could have been the bike lane. There's already been a number of cases where robots have been clipped by cars turning right on red, and that seems to be one of the more common mishaps. If that were to happen at speed, flying debris could harm a pedestrian or a cyclist, of course. Obviously, you have to integrate with what's already in place, but you would also like to scale. How will that work? This is a marketing photo to illustrate how well a fleet of robots can move through a college campus. But how would that work in our cities? Imagine this downtown at a busy intersection with multiple people waiting for the light change. Are our pavements wide enough? Will our traffic signals be suitable? Remember what I just showed you 2 slides before. This picture indicates that a new kind of congestion is possible. How will we orchestrate that? How will we manage that congestion? What rules do robots need to follow so that we don't disturb pedestrians? In the case of public area mobile robots, we believe that if we address bystanders with mobility challenges, then we will probably have covered nearly everything in terms of accessibility and acceptance. So what do we have to consider? Haben Girma is both deaf and blind, and she's a leading advocate for accessibility in the active transportation space. Her comment that disability-driven designs improve things for everyone is key. Her additional comment that we include disabled people early on in the design process is also key. I recommend both of these for your work as well. By the way, this particular robot delivery company, pictured here, focuses on an enormous amount of attention on safety issue. They've recently told us that they have found a way, which they said was very difficult, to recognize a white cane. So that's pretty remarkable if it's true, but they certainly work very hard on those kinds of issues. And that's not true of all of the companies doing this work. It's true of many of them. And what will happen is the ones that don't do that work may cause a mishap, which would make it sort of difficult for all the parties. So one way to enhance acceptance is to seek benefits for everyone, or nearly everyone, seek as many benefits as possible. It's not just for delivery convenience. It may be that we can make our walkways safer or cleaner or quieter. The person in this image has a disorder called kyphosis. She's unable to stand up straight and see ahead. She can only see perhaps a meter in front of her. She could be easily startled by a PMR that approaches her from front or behind. Something that can, I mean, it's a pretty rare circumstance, but still, it's very easy to startle people when you pass them on the sidewalk. So we believe that we also believe there's many opportunities to help seniors and disabled pedestrians with their shopping, to keep the sidewalk ice-free, to be protective, and even to provide personal transport in the form of an automated wheelchair. There are so many opportunities to increase both accessibility and acceptance, but that will take foresight, imagination, and social-oriented attention. So everything has an environmental impact. It's often argued that using small robots for local delivery reduces the use of cars and trucks. That seems to be true. But does it also increase consumption of food and groceries? That's unmeasured so far. Ideally, more mobility services that mean people drive less might help car ownership. There are many reports of households that now own one fewer car because of ride hailing. Would robots help in the same way? We think this is likely only if robotic delivery is part of a suite of mobility services. In other words, having robots for Amazon and Uber Eats is not enough to reduce the use of ownership of vehicles. In this case, this is Milton Keynes, a pretty special case. This is the largest single installation of delivery robots in the Western world. We don't know that number for a Chinese city, but this is in England. And there's, the last I looked, approximately 300 robots operating in this city. It's ideally designed for these, by the way, because there is good news here. And this particular city councilor pointed out that robots are more likely to replace car trips than walking trips. In other words, they weren't replacing personal bicycle or walking trips, they were replacing car trips. The number I've heard from two places is something on the order of 70% of the robot trips were replacing car trips, which is a remarkably excellent outcome, but I have no way to confirm that. This same counselor in the same interview spoke about other potential benefits for the town. So this speaks to the importance of not just delivery. It speaks to the importance, in this case, of multiple applications that would be beneficial. So here's some of the ones that this particular council mentioned. And I sort of indicated social care in an earlier slide. In this case, in this example, this robot is from Singapore, and it's this is a couple of years ago, and it's been upgraded already. But this robot is an experimental device, but it points to a few pretty important things. First of all, many robots can do more than one thing at once, partly because the sensors needed to navigate can, in this case, can also be used to inspect the pavement. And the communication system that is needed for it to operate can return the data from the pavement that can help build the necessary reports, in this case. Some robotic platforms can be fitted with several tools. There's a company in Denmark with a much smaller robot than this, that it can remove cigarette butts, it removes chewing gum, it salts the sidewalk, it picks litter, it does dozens of other things in construction environments, but that's beside the point here. And I'm sure it can be fitted to write parking tickets. By the way, that's not the only company that's discussed that. So these robots have very, very many applications, and they're not all transportation applications. It's pretty important to think about that, because that makes these robots far more valuable to our public works department than simply delivery robots for our logistics, urban logistics, which is also of course important. So now you've developed something, you've patented it, you've written all the software. Now you want to start to scale. That's obviously what all of us go into business for, is to scale. So what about how will that scalability and integration with other modes of transportation work? So I have many times seen a very exciting technology for a pilot, but it wasn't invited back to become full deployment because it just didn't work at scale. I don't want to give the example of the cities because some of them are our members that have tried and set them back. They want to use them, they see the value, but the technology just wasn't ready. Now, I showed you earlier, very early on, pictures of infrastructure that wasn't ready. So what happens is either the city's not ready with its bylaws or with its police department or its organization, or the infrastructure is not ready. So if the infrastructure is not ready, then by definition, your technology is not ready, because your technology has to consider that infrastructure. It's probably easier for you to innovate around the infrastructural problem than it is for you to change the infrastructure. It's an enormous multi-billion-dollar problem to change that infrastructure. So you're going to have to constrain your applications to where it will work. So in the case of mobile robots, it would be unworkable not to have traffic or enforcement oversight, for exactly the same reason that road vehicles operate under regulations and enforcement systems. You can imagine that no supplier would like to be constrained, but a multiplicity of systems is not going to work unless they're organized and coordinated. So imagine you have delivery fleets from 3 or 5 different companies. You have a couple of different maintenance fleets from different companies. So you have 6 or 8 or 12 different companies wanting to share the space at the same time. That's already occurred in one city. First, I've seen that in this city was in the US, in which 2 companies operate in the same area, and they've already run into conflicts, blaming each other for various things and so forth, because they're not orchestrated. They're just 2 companies operating independently, and they're not orchestrated. So you can imagine that no supplier would like to be constrained, but it's not going to work without coordination. And so the best way to go about this, we think, the best way to go about this coordination is that the commercial operators collaborate with the accessibility community to ensure that there's sufficient and properly maintained infrastructure for all the parties to safely operate. So in the end, that's going to require monetization in the form of licensing fees and usage fees and so on in order to support enforcement and traffic oversight. We're not going to have this kind of public robot without that kind of oversight and orchestration. So you're going to need some data. What about data and privacy? My recommendation, because I have a long history in data standards as well, is that you destroy the data you don't need. You capture the data you need to do your job. As soon as you don't need it anymore, you destroy that data for its privacy value, and you just don't want to have data you don't need, first of all. Now, it's also the case that certain aspects of your data may be required by the city you're operating in order for the city to manage the right-of-way. And so you can see in this example from Los Angeles, there is something known as the Open Mobility Foundation. And that foundation has defined something called the Mobility Data Specification. And in this case, Los Angeles is asking its micromobility users to supply certain data according to these standards to the city in order for them to manage the right of way. Now, if you have to do that, and I believe you will have to do that in many of these, if your deployment is in a public space, when you have to do this, of course, you need to anonymize that data. That's not surprising, but these are things that you have to make sure you are aware of, because there's a cost and there's an effort, and then you will need to do that. Otherwise, you'll be disappointed and you won't be able to deploy. By the way, what is the community impact of your innovation? So that was about the city and privacy and permissions and traffic and so on. What does the community like what you're doing? I gave you the earlier example of a company that, largely speaking, the user community liked it, but the accessibility community didn't. So what will the impact be? In this case, this is an interesting image from a report that's probably the most extensive multi-city pilot for this technology tried in the United States. It may be the largest one in the world. It was from a couple of years ago. And this study uncovered a range of attitudes, which included things such as amusement and fascination, fear, concern for job loss. The same study found a number of infrastructure shortcomings. That early image I showed you with the robot stuck on the sidewalk with the overgrown bushes from the same study. They also found roads they couldn't cross. The roads were too wide to cross in the given time, which meant that it was also too wide for pedestrians. So they discovered pedestrian problems. Remember, I said we need to collaborate between pedestrians and this technology. That's an example of it. In any case, I learned more from this report because there was so many shortcomings with the actual study itself. I learned more about the difficulty of developing a community impact study. So if you need to do a community impact study, I would grab this report and see what happened and what went wrong with the technology, what were the shortcomings, and try to understand what you might find out about your case if you were to do such a report. One thing that I learned from this report is that this kind of robot, that's very simple. You see it in front of the children. It's a simple box on wheels. It's teleoperated. It is a very, very limited business case. And there's a lot of companies building this particular kind of robot. And it needs to have more than just simply food delivery to be, I think, as a viable business. So here's some of the output. This was fun from not just children, but some people thought it was very cool. Some people just don't like robots. It doesn't matter what you do or whatever. They just don't like them. that can change, but you would go into an environment where not everybody loves the idea. There was throughout concerns about vandalism and theft and so on, and there was especially concern about usability of the robots by the blind. Now that has two aspects. One aspect is will the robot be an obstacle for me if I'm blind? That's a very important question. It turns out that they're not, but that doesn't mean that the fear isn't there. I think the fear is very real, and the fear deserves to be there. The other aspect, and that was when I showed you Haben Girma earlier, one of her concerns was that her application, her app on her smartphone, it was a blind deaf app from which she uses to order food, and she couldn't use that robot to order food because it wasn't connected to the app. And her complaint was that she's been excluded from the technology. Not that she was worried about the technology, because her dog did not have a problem with it, but she wanted to be included, and I don't blame her. So it's not just accessibility from a safety perspective, very important, but it's also to be inclusive as well. So that's the elements that I wanted to talk about. The last thing I want to leave you with before I stop for questions, I hope there are some, is that we are developing 3 guides. There's a guide, the executive guide is pretty short. I think it's on the order of 50 pages. It's pretty digestible. It's free, and you can go to our site and order a copy of that. It's coming in the first of the new year. There's 2 other guides. One is the discovery guide. It's considerably longer, and it is to help cities understand what are all the elements they need to think about. In other words, it's this talk times 100 to sort of think about all the aspects and considerations to make a decision how you want to go about, or when you want to go about being ready for these devices. It's probably the case that you can't avoid it forever. You can put it off for a while. At some point, you're going to turn to it, and the question is, then what? And that's what the discovery guide is for. And then when you finally do decide to turn to it, there's a project guide for your project team. It could be in your transportation department, it could be in your public works department. But that 3rd guide is the workbook for workshops to actually set up and prepare for the best practices to set these up. I'm showing you this because I think that you should develop a deployment guide for your innovation. Whatever work you're doing, it's probably a simpler circumstance than this set of guides. It's a very long and extensive. But whatever you do and are deploying, you should write and publish such a guide. You will learn something from doing it about your own technology, by the way. And when you do that, your customers can understand your dedication to the deployment problem, because you need to have, if you're going to deploy in a city, you need to understand the city's constraints. The city has a lot more constraints than your physical mechatronic, mobility constraints. The city has very many more than that. And so that helps you understand that when you write that deployment guide. Last thing, the executive guide is free. I think I mentioned that. You can go to our site. And with that, I want to thank you very much. And I'm going to stop sharing and take any questions that anybody has.
Perfect. Does anyone have any questions for Bern?
I have one. So Bern, I'll say so different cities of different sizes probably have different constraints, right? So, but I'll put you on the spot and say, what are the top 3 to 5 constraints that are common at any city that wants to be able to implement this technology in their environment?
I'm going to say the first constraint is that a portion of the population will be concerned in some way or another. They may be concerned about, as happened in the city of Toronto, they were concerned about the blind being able to navigate without concern. There are a small number of people that worry about jobs, but that will never go away. I think the major concern beyond just, I don't say just, but beyond accessibility, the major concern is our infrastructure suitable? Not every city is up to accessibility standards. So the Ontario accessibility standards, here in Toronto, there's places in where I live here in Toronto, there's places without sidewalks. There's places where the sidewalk is too narrow. And so that I want to say it's the accessibility and the infrastructure, which are related, and then the fears that people have. Those are probably the major concerns.
Okay. I'll ask one more and then hopefully hand it back to the field. You also said monetization needs to be built in from the start, right? I'll be assumptive and say you meant the city, right? So, or did you mean the robot company?
So I mean the city. And what cities do so far is that they will charge a like a licensing fee or a registration fee, that sort of thing. It's the same thing. So Uber charges a fee, and they charge a per kilometer fee, that sort of thing. That's what I mean by monetization.
Yeah.
But the robots need to be monetized like that. So not the robots work. So there might be a robot working for the police department or for the fire department. I'm not talking about those. I'm talking about the robots that are performing commercial activities, not just delivery. You could have a robot that performs perimeter security for a company, and that part of that perimeter security means that robot goes on the public sidewalk near that building. And if that were to happen, that should be monetized. It's not because the city needs money, which is an independent issue. It's because the city needs to enforce. The city needs to come. If something happens to that robot, the city may need to clean it up. It's actually possibility that a robot may need to be seized and impounded if something goes wrong. And so the city needs to have its police force trained for those things, for example, and so on. So that's why the monetization has to be there. And it doesn't have to be there on day one. It just, the licensing and certification is enough on day one. But eventually you're going to have to monetize by use, because you wouldn't want to have a company that's got a lot of robots that's running 7/24 be paying the same thing that a salt operator is just running a few days of the year. So that has to be by use.
Are there, you get to see probably a worldwide perspective on this, right? Are there cities in the world who are doing this well, right? And the corollary to that is, are there cities who are not? Right? And so what are they doing well, and what are the ones who are not doing it well? What are they doing, I want to say wrong, but what could they do better?
Well, there are, just a second. There are cities that do it very well, and I'm using the Milton Keynes example. I know there's cities in China that seem to be doing it.
Stand and mic stand setup.
But I don't know that. But in any case, there are cities in the U.S. now that are permitting in a constrained area, constrained service area, that are permitting one system to operate, and that one system may have a few tens of robots. So they're probably doing it well in that they're watching, they're permitting them, and so forth. There are cities that have banned them in the U.S. There's been 2 cities that I know of in Canada that have banned them. So that's not necessarily good or bad. I think that at least one of the 2 cities in Canada that banned them weren't ready for them. I think they did the right thing by banning them, but that's not the same thing. That's not what you're asking. They didn't. There is a city I know of in the United States that has permitted 2 operators to operate at the same time. And that's a dangerous circumstance for both of those companies, because one of the things that's happened is Company A behaves really well. Company A always waits for a fresh walk signal. Company A does not enter the crosswalk or the intersection until it has a fresh green walk signal. Company B is teleoperated. Company A is automated and company B is teleoperated. You wouldn't know if you were there, you wouldn't tell the difference, but company B is teleoperated and company B incentivized their operators on speed. So company B doesn't wait for the walk signal and it just looks through its cameras to see if it can cross and it just crosses. You know, like when you were a teenager and you just crossed when you wanted to cross and you didn't wait for the light. And so now both of those companies, one behaving very strictly and one behaving quite aggressively, are both operating at the same intersections. That's a problem. And I think that city is making a mistake permitting that, allowing that to happen. I don't know if that's a complete answer, but.
No, that's fair. That's good. Any other questions from the audience, either directly or in chat?
Lee,
Yeah, Richard, I had a couple of questions. So I'm not sure if any of the participants on the call wanted to ask specific questions about your innovation or technology. So Bern's expertise obviously, extends far beyond public area mobile robots, and most of the examples that we've been using have been focused on that. But recognizing that CITM and Innovation Factory are, appeal to a broader audience, I just wanted to encourage you to, if you wanted to use this opportunity to ask Bern any other questions about any other mobility innovations, or even just to have a chance, I wanted to encourage you to do that. And while you're thinking about what those questions are, Bern, I just wonder if there's anything else that you wanted to mention about the different types of standards that people have been using in your experience. That we've talked about the fact that 1342, I think, is a safety standard that has proven to be insufficient. And so sort of looking at some of the different experiences that you've had, I think that we want to make sure that our audience really understands that the range of standard types. And so it's really going beyond safety standards, just to kind of reinforce that theme for our call today, our webinar.
So there's kind of two questions there. Does anybody have a question about their own innovation or work? Let's take that first.
So Ellen Partridge has a question that says, many of the laws in the US appear to privilege one particular manufacturer over others. How should regulators address this at this point? That's
interesting. So Ellen, what you've observed in the US, so there's 20 some states in the US, and what I believe you, if I understand what you have seen, is that the 20 different state guides are different. So one of them says the robot can be this size and this speed. The other one says the robot can be this other size and speed. And that was because company number one, I know which companies there are, but I don't want to make this about brands, but there was a delivery company with a smaller robot that went first to one of the states. I think it went probably to Virginia, but doesn't matter. Went to one of the states and said, our robot's wonderful. Can you, permit that? And they did. After, with that lobbyist's encouragement, they passed a bylaw or a House bill and a Senate bill. Then another company with a much larger robot, and was from one of the express delivery companies, said, hey, whoa, we're building one too. And that is not big enough. We need a bigger one. So they went to other states. So basically, 3 different companies went to this full set of 20 states, and each lobbying for their own particular device, their own size. So, one was lobbying for something the size of a small refrigerator, and some was lobbying the size of a beer cooler. And so we ended up with kind of like 6 or 8 sort of different classes of House bills based on, these 3 different sizes. Now, they actually caused 2 of the states went back and rewrote their House bill when they saw what they had done, having made it too small and so forth. That's an example of, in this case, we need the federal government to come in and make some blanket understanding that the states can operate from, and then the cities can operate from. It's a very serious problem that you've observed. And this is going to take us years to sort through this.
But it's also sort of an example of why the work that you're doing on global standards is so important. And why, we're trying to build this collaborative of communication and helping to shape those standards, right? So obviously those manufacturers did their lobbying, they're helping to shape standards that work for them individually, but then they aren't able to then go to the next state and operate because somebody else got there first. So I think it's an interesting sort of justification almost for the work that we're doing with the URF. So
I want to come back to your other question just before we answer Andy's question. You asked the question about safety. So first of all, there's lots of standards. There's lots of standards about robots in factories and warehouses, and there are safety standards for robots in factories and warehouses, and that somewhat apply to what are known as social robots. So robots that would operate, for example, in a long-term care home or in a hospital. So there's lots of safety standards for many of those things. So for example, if you are having an operation and a robot is operating on your body, there are standards for those things. What was missing, and is still until it's finished, are deployment standards. So as an example, there is no standard for a city to tell a robot what its speed should be, or what side of the sidewalk it should be on, or how much of a berth it should give around a transit stop. In other words, there's no way for a city to say, during these hours you cannot use this part of the pavement. You can't use the sidewalk in front of the train station between 6 a.m. and 9 a.m. For example, I'm just giving examples. There was no structured way for a city to inform a robot company about its rules. I mean, the robot company could simply do that on its own, but the city could do that on its own, but each city would have to do their own way, so that each robot operator, as it goes from city to city, would have a whole different book of rules from each city. There was no common language and no common metric to express that. And that's what this standard that I'm talking to you about, 4448, is a deployment standard. Of course, it has safety elements, but its safety is one slice of the full thing. And that was, Lee mentioned ISO 13482. If you're doing robots at all, that's an important safety standard. And it has been criticized by not having nearly enough of the kinds of things I'm talking about in order for it to be a safety standard for the kinds of robots that we're building now that are in public, operating in the public domain. So I hope that.
Yeah. That's great. Thank you. Andy, did you want to go next? And then there's a question in the chat from Sahar Javeen.
Andy, you're on mute.
Sorry, I didn't have a question.
Oh, okay.
Hand this up. Okay.
Sahar's question, did you want to ask it, or do you want, I'll just say, can you talk about, go ahead.
Hi, thank you for sharing all the information and knowledge about robotics. This is something new for me. I have been part of innovation in finance, and we have talked about urban mobility and how the payments would be integrated into it. But I was thinking when these robotic companies are working with authorities who are handling infrastructure, so are they co-creating with them? Are they innovating with those authorities? And I was thinking, does the infrastructure also need to innovate with the same speed maybe the robotic companies are innovating? So a lot of things are coming in my mind, such as old infrastructure, how it would innovate itself to fit the needs of, let's say, future urban mobility. So all these things, because innovation cannot be limited to just robotic companies or their motives of maybe higher revenue or better, delivery or something. It has to be a co-creation between all entities. And this is what I was doing I'm doing in finance, working with Visa, but I'm thinking, is this happening? Is this something what you are experiencing, and how does it look like?
That is absolutely what we're experiencing. One of the things we say, there's a couple of things that we say. One is that that urban robotics needs to be not just our foundation, but the design and the deployment of robotic devices in the urban space has to be accessibility oriented. It has to be accessible design or universal design and so forth in its deployment. The second thing that we say is related to that is that we absolutely need collaboration amongst all the players. So we need collaboration between the planners and the city, between the logistics companies and the roboticists, but all of them need to collaborate with the accessibility community, as I mentioned in my talk. So a very simple example of what you first brought up is collaboration with infrastructure. And there is a notion that we have something called complete streets. In other words, you're going to redesign your streets. Is there sufficient place for cycling, for walking, for charging bikes, for parking scooters? So does your street handle all the forms of mobility that you want? When you design such a street, you may have, one less driving lane, automotive lane, but you're going to have, cycling and other amenities for mobility. Those designs, which have been around now for more than a decade, and they're wonderful. And there's cities that have started to change a few of them. There's a beautiful example of it in London, Ontario, for example, was finished just, kind of 2018 or 2019, just beautiful. None of those designs have explicit thoughts about robotics. So all of a sudden, we're just learning how to do, these are very expensive operations, and we're just learning how to do them. And we say, wait a minute, you have to include robots. And if I were in the city, if I were the city infrastructure department, I'd be pulling my hair out. It's like, we're barely understanding what to do now. And now you want us to include. So I don't think it's feasible to say, oh, we need to change all the infrastructure first. I think what we do need to do is we need to go about this in a very limited fashion so that we can cope with what is there. And when I say we, the robotics operators can do the best they can with what's there, which is what they're doing now. Do that to the limit that it doesn't harm any of the existing users, the accessibility to any existing users. And then as time goes on, as we go into redesigning various areas for various reasons, that's exactly what you suggested. Should they collaborate? Yes. That's when the transit people should, or the redesign, the infrastructure redesign should say, are we going to permit, does this city want to permit robotics? Do we have a space for that? How do we organize that space so that, because space needs to be legible. When you go out into space, when you go out walking, you need to understand where to walk. And when somebody is, for example, I'm on a particular sidewalk in the city and I see an e-bike going quite quickly on the sidewalk, I know it should not be there. I mean, I understand what that space is meant for. But when I see a 6-year-old child on their bike, I understand that's okay and so forth. So when I talk about legibility, that the space needs to be organized and laid out and with appropriate street furniture so that when people are using it, when a tourist comes to visit, they understand how to walk or ride or use that infrastructure. That has to be done with robotics in mind over the future. So what you're asking, Sahar, is going to take decades.
But I don't want to leave you with a feeling of disappointment or concern, because we do have a number of municipalities who are members of the Urban Robotics Foundation who are doing some really innovative things around it's part of the smart city planning and all those kind of committees that are being formed globally. And there's an organization called Intelligent Communities Foundation, I believe Hamilton and other cities in Canada at least are qualified in some of the training there. And it's really about preparing from a communications perspective, for the example that Bern was talking about, to be able to have the robot or have whatever other mobility device be able to talk to the crosswalk signal and things like that. So there's lots of progress being made, but infrastructure takes longer to develop than the software and the enabling technology. So there are, it is definitely a collaborative effort that's required. And part of the work that we're doing is to really share those best practices globally. And you'll be able to read about an exciting city in Australia that's doing some things that we're going to be promoting tomorrow on our blog post. So
there's dozens and many hundreds of cities that are in between the sort of 30,000 and 100,000 range that are sufficiently well laid out, have sufficient ambulatory infrastructure or walking infrastructure, that have city councils that are interested in this. So I think, Lee, the one that you're thinking about in not New Zealand, but in Australia, yes. I think that's kind of a 40 or 50,000 population city, and it is totally suited to have this technology. And they're completely equipping their city with the infrastructure to run the communications, whether they're teleoperated or automated, doesn't matter. And they like the fact that we're promoting more than just delivery, promoting the security and the maintenance aspects as well. And
closer to home, the Ontario government has just funded the demonstration zones for the city of Markham and the city of Vaughan. So those, if you haven't heard about them, Richard, I'm not sure, Greta, I'm not sure if you guys have promoted that to your audience or not, but they're definitely looking for pilot projects and applicants. And then also, I know we have Patrick on the call here, Patrick from Michigan, and there's a lot of work being done in Detroit as well. And it's about pilot testing, right? So there's so much to learn and so much to develop. So, but picking an area of your city where you can, work on the infrastructure and then include that in your planning going forward. So with that, I'll leave it to Richard and Greta to close this off. Thank you.
Yeah, just a couple things. The demonstration zone is part of the OVIN network, Ontario Vehicle Innovation Network. It's launched, but not formally, meaning the process to get your project in there for demonstration hasn't formally launched yet. I know a little bit more about that. Like they're not random demonstrations. There'll be a couple of times during the year where demonstrations are organized. But it does integrate into the city of Vaughan and Markham, meaning in theory, at least you get access to the operating departments of those cities, which is a big stumbling block for major cities, right? Like most municipalities in Canada really struggle with the adoption of innovation. So that kudos to Oban and to Vaughan and Markham for finding a secret sauce on that. I had a question, Bern. There's not enough time today, and there's a whole topic around this. Maybe we add a little bit of content around this for the next time we do this next year, or you can do a blog post on it, and that it's cybersecurity in these devices. Yep. That is a big topic in the autonomous or even in the connected vehicle space. These are no different. So that I want to cover that the next time around. I'll also point out that Urban Robotics Foundation and CITM kind of formalized a partnership agreement. There will be an offer to CITM clients, right, on a discount for joining the Urban Robotics Foundation and some other things. So our website will get refreshed with that, and we'll do an article on that in the new year. So look for that if you are a client of CITM or the Innovation Factory, actually. And I wanted to say both to Bern and to Lee, thank you very much. This is a super interesting topic, I know, and there's lots going on. The number of, even at the CITM level, 18 months ago, we had 2 or 3 robot companies, and now there's probably 10. Right, and they're doing a lot more than sidewalk delivery. We have robots that are picking up golf balls, robots that, like, it's just astounding the amount of work that is going on in connected robots. Right. So with that, I will close out the hour, say thank you again. We will do this again next year. This recording will be available on the Innovation Factory's Academy property, so you can watch it on demand. And with that, happy Wednesday. Thank you again, Bern, Lee, and everyone enjoy the rest of their day.
Thanks everybody for listening. Thank you. Bye-bye.